London wasn't waking up to church bells that morning. It was waking up to the promise of blood. Crowds jammed the streets not for bread or sermons, but to watch a man carved apart in public. That man was William Wallace, and his death would be a show no one forgot. The year was 1305, and London smelled exactly as you'd expect, like sweat, horses, and too many people who thought soap was an optional lifestyle choice. Normally, the noise was vendors yelling about fresh fish, jugglers trying to earn coins, or the occasional drunk stumbling through the marketplace. But this morning had a different energy. The streets pulsed with anticipation, not because of a festival, but because King Edward I had promised a spectacle that would make every rebel in Britain think twice before sharpening a sword. Wallace wasn't the first man to be executed, but he was the biggest catch of the century. This wasn't a random thief or some nameless rebel. This was the face of Scottish resistance, the man who had embarrassed English knights in battle and refused to bow to Edward's authority. To the English crowd, he was both villainous and curious. To Edward, he was unfinished business. And to the Scots who heard the news, he was about to become something far bigger than a rebel. He was about to become legend, though not in the way Edward intended. Now, if you've ever seen the movie version of Wallace's life, you've been sold a very polished fairy tale. Braveheart gave us slow-motion screams of freedom, blue war paint, and a heroic quick death. Reality was stripped of all that cinematic neatness. There was no sudden fade to black, no swelling soundtrack, no mercy. Edward made sure Wallace's end was drawn out, humiliating, and spectacular. He wanted pain turned into propaganda, cruelty into cautionary tale. This wasn't about ending one man's life. It was about making rebellion itself look like a suicide mission. But Wallace hadn't started life aiming to be anyone's symbol. He wasn't born a noble with lands and castles. He wasn't trained from childhood to lead armies. He was just a minor landowner who'd been pushed too far. His family suffered under English occupation, and when he finally picked up a sword, it wasn't to chase glory. It was revenge, mixed with the stubborn fury of a man who refused to kneel. In 1297, he struck back at Stirling Bridge, where his ragtag forces pulled off the impossible. They didn't just win, they shattered the myth of English invincibility. Knights in heavy armor were supposed to be untouchable, and Wallace turned them into cannon fodder before cannons even existed. That victory made him a national hero overnight, and it also painted a massive target on his back. Edward, known as Longshanks, wasn't the kind of king who ignored slights. He was ruthless, cold, and efficient in crushing opposition. He had already broken Wales and expelled the Jews from England, and he viewed Scotland not as a country, but as an unruly province that needed a leash. Wallace's victory made Edward look weak, and kings don't like looking weak, especially kings like him. So he set out to destroy Wallace the way you destroy a wildfire. You smother it completely. Wallace spent the next several years as a fugitive. He hid in forests, relied on sympathizers, struck where he could, and kept the dream of Scottish defiance alive. But the longer the fight dragged on, the more dangerous it became to be associated with him. Many Scottish nobles had already bent the knee to Edward, preferring a humiliating peace over annihilation. Wallace's very existence embarrassed them, a reminder that some still resisted. It was only a matter of time before betrayal did what English steel couldn't. That betrayal came in 1305. The exact details are muddy, but the gist is that Wallace was cornered near Glasgow, almost certainly because someone close to him decided survival was more important than loyalty. He was captured, bound, and dragged away. Not to a battlefield, but to a stage where Edward had written the script. And make no mistake, this was theater. The trial, the sentence, the execution, all of it was planned for maximum impact. From the moment Wallace was caught, his punishment became a traveling circus. He was hauled through English towns on the way to London, paraded like a trophy. People jeered, spat, and cursed at him, not even knowing the man personally, but enjoying the show of a captured rebel. Imagine being forced to march through town squares where you're less a person and more an exhibit. That humiliation was just the opening act. When Wallace finally arrived in London, he was tossed into the Tower to await his fate. His trial at Westminster Hall was less fair court of law and more scripted roast with a death sentence at the end. The charges? Treason, murder, arson, sacrilege, basically a laundry list of whatever they could dream up. The irony, of course, was that Wallace wasn't guilty of treason, because he never acknowledged Edward as his king. He even said so. How can a man betray a lord he never swore loyalty to? But Edward wasn't interested in technicalities. He wanted a show, not an argument. The guilty verdict was decided before Wallace even walked in the room. And the punishment? The worst England had in its bag of tricks: hanging, drawing, and quartering. Reserved for traitors, it wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to humiliate, terrorize, and linger in people's nightmares. Each stage had symbolism: dragged to the gallows for disgrace, hanged but cut down alive to prolong the agony, disemboweled to strip away humanity, beheaded to silence forever, and quartered to erase the body itself. Edward wasn't just killing Wallace, he was turning him into a lesson carved into living flesh. Execution Day was a carnival. Thousands crammed the streets, vendors selling pies and ale, parents lifting children onto their shoulders, as if this were some kind of parade. It wasn't just justice, it was entertainment. The medieval version of pay-per-view, except the only ticket price was standing room among the stink of humanity. Wallace was stripped naked, tied to a wooden hurdle, and dragged through the city. The cobblestones shredded his body as he was hauled mile after mile. People laughed, cheered, hurled garbage, even rocks. The man who once terrified the English army was reduced to a bleeding, battered spectacle, dragged like a carcass to the slaughter. Medieval society thrived on this kind of theater. Public executions were the glue holding authority together, reminders that power didn't just punish, it performed. The brutality wasn't hidden, it was paraded. If you were there, you weren't just a spectator, you were part of the ritual, whether you cheered, gagged, or tried to look away. Finally, the executioner ended it with a clean stroke of the axe, severing Wallace's head. But even then, his degradation wasn't over. The head was dipped in tar to preserve it, the sticky black coating making sure it wouldn't rot too quickly, and then it was mounted high on London Bridge as a grim warning to every traveler entering the city. Imagine crossing into the capital and being greeted by the lifeless face of the man who once terrified English armies, now reduced to a grotesque ornament. His body didn't escape such theatrics either. It was hacked into 4 quarters, each packaged like a royal message of fear, and shipped off to different towns across Scotland and northern England. In Newcastle, his leg was hung where every merchant could see it. In Stirling, an arm dangled like a butcher's prize. Another quarter rotted in Perth. Edward turned Wallace's body into a gruesome map of obedience, a physical reminder carved into the landscape that rebellion ended in dismemberment. And for years, people would pass by those pieces, not in silence, but with the uneasy chatter of those reminded daily who truly ruled them. And for a while, it seemed to work. Fear settled in, rebellions grew quieter, and Scotland's nobles, already weary of resistance, stayed cautious. Edward congratulated himself on a job well done, but cruelty has a way of backfiring. Wallace's death was supposed to erase him. Instead, it carved him deeper into Scotland's memory. The man torn apart became the glue holding rebellion together. Robert the Bruce would later rise to lead Scotland, and though Wallace never lived to see it, his shadow hung over every battle. His name became a whispered prayer, his fate a reminder of what submission really meant. His execution had revealed the face of English justice, and once people saw it, they couldn't forget. Instead of silencing defiance, it made submission unbearable. Wallace's gruesome end had shown the cost of freedom, but it also showed the ugliness of tyranny. And sometimes that's enough to turn fear into fury, because when people realize that death in resistance is no worse than life in chains, the choice becomes clear. Centuries later, Wallace's story is still told. It's been polished, dramatized, even romanticized, but the heart of it remains. A man brutally destroyed in body became indestructible in memory. Edward thought he had killed rebellion. What he actually did was give it a martyr. Wallace's screams didn't vanish into the air that day. They echoed through history, louder than any speech. And maybe that's the strangest irony of all. The most brutal death in medieval England became the most enduring story of Scottish resistance. Edward had the power to kill Wallace's body, but not the idea he represented. In fact, the sheer excess of his cruelty made sure the idea lived forever. Wallace proved that sometimes the more violently a ruler tries to erase a symbol, the brighter it burns. So the next time you picture medieval history as dusty scrolls and boring kings, remember that in 1305, an entire city gathered to watch a man torn apart, cheering, while it happened. It was grotesque, it was theatrical, and it was unforgettable. And in the middle of that nightmare, one man's refusal to beg turned him into something larger than life. You can cut a man into 4 pieces, but you can't quarter an idea. If this story grabbed you, stay tuned. History is full of tales even bloodier, stranger, and more dramatic than any movie dares to show.